So here we are on the actual lesson. So I'm going to start from where I left off in the last little section with the engage. So with the engage, we're using the gizmos. The gizmos are one of the simulations I had asked everyone to sign up for at the beginning of our course. There was that initial welcome to the class announcement, and you were supposed to sign up for the gizmos, download the textbook, and some other things. So the gizmos, if you don't recall, is a website. It's called Explore Learning, and the gizmos are a group of simulations. So you do have to log in, and each of you should have created a login and joined my classroom at the beginning. If you do not have that login information, then you might want to go back to the very first announcement and double check. If you've logged in and lost your password, you can email me and I will tell you what your password was. So when you log into the Explore Learning Gizmos, one of the first things that you'll be looking at is this gizmo here, and it's called the Natural Selection Gizmo. In the Natural Selection Gizmo, you're doing this before you do any lesson. So in this Natural Selection Gizmo, you are going to have light trees and dark trees. So start with the light trees. And you are going to hit play. And every time you see a moth, you're going to click on it. So you're eating it. Some of the moths are light and some are dark. So obviously the light ones are more challenging to see. The dark ones are easy. So I'm going to see those really easily. I'm going to click on next tree each time, and it's timed. So I'm trying to collect as many of these as I can. So now the year is over. It's counted how many moths I captured in the first year. It's put it into this table. I click continue and I go to the next year. I'll do one more year. And what you're doing in this activity is you're noticing how the frequency of these moths change. And even though I keep on skipping, there are some moths on these pages that I'm skipping. I just can't see them very well. So I'm just trying to find the dark ones because I can click on them really easily. See there? There. So you're going to continue working through that. You're going to complete this gizmo and you're going to answer a few questions, some notes. Okay? Next, you're going to go into a Nearpod. So we've used the Nearpod in our class before. In the past, I did it live in class and I shared it with everybody and we did it at the same time. Because you're all coming in at different times, I will give you a Google Classroom link and you'll go to the Nearpod and you'll work your way through it. In the Nearpod, you'll be asked some questions, do the multiple choice, the polling. There'll be a few places that there'll be a voiceover on the slides to give you better clarification. For those of you who had Miss Demeter in grade 10, she created this Nearpod, some of the Nearpod pieces in there. So when you're looking and trying to identify what voice it is, it's Miss Demeter's voice. And work your way through this. When you finish this Nearpod, which we'll be able to look at, right? I'll be able to see all your results and I'll share your drawings with the class, so be appropriate. Then you're going to go to another gizmo. And this gizmo falls directly after the Nearpod. In this gizmo, you're going to be looking at how rainfall affects bird beaks. At this moment in time, this doesn't make all that much sense because you have not gone through that particular part of the lesson. But when you work your way through the Nearpod, you're going to be exploring all about Darwin and who Darwin was and how his observations allowed him to come up with the idea of natural selection. And in this case, they're looking at real-time evolution of birds occurring over a relatively short period of time. So once you watch that Nearpod, you'll then be able to work through this gizmo, adjusting the amount of water each year, and depending on how you adjust it, when you run it, you may see evolution occurring. You have a table tab, a graph, histogram that you can refer to. All right? So that will be your Explore. Once you complete that, then you're going to work your way. So I'm going to pause. Say pause, because maybe you're going to work through it. Okay, unpause. Now, the next section is the explain. So this is where I actually teach. But before I teach, I'm going to ask you a few questions. If you go back to your Google Doc, you'll see these questions on your Google Doc. In the first question, I want you to imagine a dark cave where a lot of little beetles live. Some of the beetles are very, very black, and some of them are very bright green. There's variation in the population, so that's an interesting word, as a word we'll explore a little bit later. There are also predators that hunt the bugs in the cave. So if you visit that same population 50 years later, how do you think that population will look? So quick answer, 1 sentence or 2. Pause. Unpause. Right? I'm not going to say that all the time. I guess I'll say pause to let you know when's a good time to answer. Next question, continue thinking about the bug population. What if it cost the bugs a large amount of energy to produce the black color, whereas the bright green color is very cheap? What effect will those conditions have on the population after a long period of time? So it's a slightly different wrinkle from this first question. So go ahead and answer. Pause. Unpause. Within our bug population, consider a new mutation. Imagine one bug is born navy blue. This color is genetically similar to the bright green color, so it's energetically inexpensive. So it's cheap, just like the green. But it's dark. It's not black, but it's dark. What do you predict will happen in the generations following the birth of the bug with this mutation? So now you have 3 beetles. You got the black, which is dark. You have the light green, which is inexpensive. And you got the navy blue, which is inexpensive, but also dark in the dark cave. So you're answering those 3 questions. I'm not going to read this last statement because that is kind of a follow-up to your think. So you're going to think aloud, share your idea with the person on, if you're collaborating with somebody on Zoom or whatever media you're using. And then once you've done that, then look at the answers. Or we'll look at this last statement that I'm highlighting here. Okay. So that brings us over to the presentation, microevolution. So before I talk about what evolution is, which you explored in the Nearpod, you have a definition. We also talked about it before the break. We also talked about it during the evidence for evolution. We're looking at something known as the change in populations. Change is the key word. But as we look at different ideas of evolution, that what is changing is what defines what kind of evolution we're looking at. So microevolution is something we're focusing on in this unit. For us to talk about microevolution, we do need to understand something called variation. So variation, if you ever look at a population, I don't know if you guys have ever looked at ladybugs, but here I have the site here. So this site is all about ladybugs. This is actually one species of ladybug, and it has many different variations in the population. So which one's most successful? Why the different variations? Why do you have some black with few spots? Why do you have some black with lots of spots? Why do you have some gold with no spots? And so on and so on. We have different species of ladybugs that are completely different. The 8 spotted, the 16 spotted, but this is one type of ladybug beetle that has many variations. So these variations, these tiny little differences in the population, they're kind of the foundation for evolution and for the environment to now have some significant pressure on the population. Now, as we're talking about this variation in the population, in genetics, we talked about how in mitosis, the chromosomes can exchange DNA in the form of synapses. So when you have an original DNA and exchanges a little segment, that's known as recombination. The DNA recombines and forms a brand new DNA. This recombination is very important when you start talking about genetically unique organisms. If an organism is going to have variation and look or act or have some other physiological difference, typically that's going to be defined by the DNA. So how do you get different DNA? Well, one happens during meiosis, that crossing over. I think I said mitosis a moment ago, I meant meiosis. The other one happens during Mendel's third law, where you get that random assortment of chromosomes. So you might have blue, red, 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 or blue, red, or whatever it might assort to. And of course you have the eggs. Remember, 300,000 eggs in a woman once she gets past puberty, and millions of sperm. So when you take a combination of many of those eggs and many of those sperms, there's so many different possibilities. So there's a lot of different ways for the DNA to recombine. Now the definition of microevolution, it's evolution, but it's focused on the allele frequencies. In the engage you did at the very beginning of this lesson, you looked at moths and you saw how the black moths and the white moth populations changed over time. That is called industrial melanism, and it's associated with the pre-industrial and post-industrial England landscape. In the video that you're about to watch, we're going to look at bird beaks, and we're going to see how the bird beaks will change over a period of time. If you have a rabbit and it's kind of, white, well, in that rabbit population, there's going to be variation. Some are going to be really white, and some are going to be a little bit brown, and some might be even black. If we're in this Arctic area, those rabbits that are hopping around, the dark ones are going to be really easy for the snowy owl to pick off. The light ones are going to be hidden on the background. So over a period of time, those white rabbits are going to be more successful, and the dark rabbits are going to be picked off. And as you see the population change to more white rabbits, that is a classic example of microevolution. Microevolution does rely on 5 key ingredients, and here you see them: natural selection, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and non-random mating. So I just listed them off, but they really probably mean very little to you. You might have heard of some of the words and parts, but now we're going to define them and relate them specifically to microevolution. So to be clear, microevolution, let me get my laser pointer here. Microevolution is made up of these very specific components of natural selection, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and non-random mating. So, natural selection. So this is the bulk of our lesson. This is where our lesson focuses. So natural selection is something that most people walking into grade 11 biology especially have heard of. This is a familiar trope in a lot of shows, whether or not it's a crime show or a mystery show or an animal show. You often hear that term survival of the fittest bandied around. So natural selection is something that you should know once you finish this grade 11 bio course, regardless of whether or not it's pandemic style or not. It's something you should know. So in red, you'll see that definition, and it is the major way in which evolution is able to act on the characteristics, the traits of individuals. And because of the natural selection acting on these individuals, the population overall will be better adapted for survival in that situation. Now, it's a really long-winded way of defining this term, but as we go over the next few slides here and you watch the movies, you should have a much better understanding. So I'm going to pause here, well, you're going to pause here, and you'll see that there's a movie that's in the Google Doc you have access to, and it's on YouTube. And as you watch the movie, you want to notice that this one in particular, I actually made a link to in the Edpuzzle in the Google Classroom. And you'll notice that there's these markers, these 4 markers, and at each of these markers, the markers occur right after the question has been answered. So what are the key components of natural selection? Well, as you watch this Edpuzzle, you will see that particular, let me open this up here. So as you watch this Edpuzzle and you hit play, there's these markers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And at each one of these markers is a question, and you can answer it directly in the document of Edpuzzle. But better yet, I would suggest that instead of answering it here, you actually answer it on the Word file that I gave you. The Google Doc, I mean, which I have open somewhere. And so you'll see those same questions. Okay. So pause, unpause. So natural selection there's a reason why it's at the top of the list. It is the one that leads to organisms adapting to their environment. And I have several examples to show you. In the video, you saw the bird bill of the hummingbird increasing or decreasing in length. That's an adaptation. Now, adaptation is a key word. You'll notice I have it in red. You should write it down. And adaptation is a really easy one to confuse with natural selection, evolution. One of the issues that most students have with this evolutionary terminology is that we have a lot of words, and many of them, their definition is slightly similar enough that you get confused. So I would encourage you to make sure you have explicit definitions and you understand what each word means. You're best off using examples and pictures to help you with that understanding. So here is a straight definition you'll see on the page. I'm going to move past this definition and go into some of my things I'd like you to write down. So adaptations, if you have a small adaptation, let's say it's a length and it gets slightly longer this generation and slightly longer the next generation, eventually you end up with some major changes. It's almost as if someone's asking you, how do you improve yourself? Some people want to be extremely fit. They want to run 10 kilometers or a marathon, and the idea of you getting up and just running immediately is not really feasible for most people. So instead what you do is you run a kilometer one day, and then a little bit more the next day, and a little bit more the next day or week. And hopefully after a period of time, you might be able to run your 10K or your marathon. Small little changes that add up to a big change. Adaptations are exactly the same thing, except from a genetic and evolutionary standpoint. Now, one of the things we didn't really focus on with a scientist, but there's two scientists I want you to know. From the first Nearpod, he explored Darwin, but there's another one named Lamarck. And Lamarck, he talked about the idea that the environment changes organisms. That's true. But he said that the organism, if it was unable to reach a giraffe, let's say, unable to reach a tree, it could stretch its neck out over its lifetime and then pass that stretched neck onto its children. It's kind of like you working out and building that six-pack and then passing that six-pack onto your children. So we know that is not true. I have to, put little air quotes on that, because if we had more time, we'd talk a little bit about something called epigenetics, which actually proves Lamarck to be true. But generally speaking, if you work out or do something, you're not going to pass that trait on to your children. So acquired characteristics are not heritable. So in this video here, you're going to watch a video about the orchid, a special orchid. And this orchid looks just like a bee. It looks like a female bee. And all the male bees will come along and they'll try to pollinate this. They'll try to make babies with this female bee, but really what's happening, they end up pollinating the flower. I encourage you to watch this video and you'll see an extreme version of adaptation. This is not something that happened over one event. This is something that likely happened over many small, tiny little changes, and over a long period of time, you ended up with this orchid that looks just like a bee. So I'll pause, unpause. All right. Other adaptations. So humans are, as you know, are often involved in situations where their head gets banged. Sometimes it's by accident, falling off a bike, walking into a glass door that you didn't know was closed. Sometimes it's on purpose. So let's look at the football situation. When we take a look at our footballers, we know that they're banging their heads all the time. Zed, I'll mention you because I know that you've had several concussions, and I believe you got them from playing football, that your head has not been designed to bang constantly. We always knew that if you banged your head really hard, that was problematic. But what we're learning over the past decade of concussion research, head research, neurobiology, all those sorts of things, that small little impacts can add up, and they can also cause major problems. So if we take a look at this, I like this one here. It's the NFL, and they've been talking about how concussions are not a problem, that you have to have serious hits in order for there to be any damage. And there's been quite a few stories been written, a lot of news articles, a movie with Will Smith. I can't remember the name of the movie, but as you look at this timeline here, you'll see that as the years have progressed and we get closer to 2020, that there's been more publicity brought to this issue of concussions. So the short of the story is we do not have adaptations in our brain to prevent head injury when our head gets hit. Another excellent example is Muhammad Ali. He was at one point, we would say, the greatest boxer of all time. And that could be debatable with other people who've boxed before and after. But he was a character, and he was a Samaritan. He represented who he was. He represented his people, his culture, and he was funny. There's a lot of good things to be said about Muhammad Ali. And so I have two video links I'd like you to watch. One of them shows a young Muhammad Ali, and in that video, you're going to see young Muhammad Ali being interviewed by, I think it's someone in Britain, and you'll see that he has a lot of life and a lot of energy, and he's funny and not aggressive in a bad way, but he's got a lot of spunk, and he reacts very quickly. And he fought a lot. He got banged in the head a lot. He actually talks about it in this little clip I'm asking you to watch. And in the second video you're going to watch, it's an older one. It's not the oldest, but he's on the talk show with Arsenio Hall. And he's on there with Mike Tyson and Sugar Ray Leonard, so a couple of other boxers. But listen to him talk. He did suffer from Parkinson's, which is clearly going to impact how he's able to interact with people. But he also suffered, like many boxers do, a lot of brain damage from the constant, fists hitting his head. Unlike us, there are animals that do have adaptations. They can bang their head over and over and over again. The woodpecker. Think about a bird and all the adaptations it has just to fly. It's got hollow bones. That's an adaptation compared to our solid bones. It has feathers that make it's able to help it be a little bit lighter and fly. It has a bill that allows it to go underneath the bark and find insects and worms. It has a lot of physiology in its head that allows it to bang its head over and over and over and over again without suffering brain damage. We don't have those adaptations, but this bird does. So there's another form of adaptation. So in addition to natural selection, which you watch the video, you answer those questions, you know the components that make up natural selection, there's also other things that contribute to microevolution. That's your key word. And these things include mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and non-random mating. In mutation, here is another word that you've most likely heard of before. And the way mutations work is they're unexpected. They're not always bad. Sometimes they're good. So when we take a look at those moths, let's say there's variation in the population. So the moths might be whitish, darkish, but there could also be a mutation that can occur in a generally white population of moths that gives you a dark moth. And let's say those dark moths, that mutated form, is more successful in that it blends in with the background, it blends in with the tree more easily. Well, that beneficial mutation will then allow that moth to have a better chance of reproducing. So mutations can be good as well as bad. And the key thing I want you to note is that the mutation is the only way we get original genetic variation. When we talk about natural selection typically, and we talk about microevolution, we're looking at the shifting of alleles from dark to light, from long to short, from heavy to light, and so on. But with mutations, you get a brand new allele, genotype, phenotype that's never existed before that might allow the organism to be more successful or not. Now, mutations have a negative word, a negative perspective, mostly because of the fact that many mutations do lead to cancers. That's what we talked about in grade 10 and a little bit in grade 11. But there are some positive mutations that can occur. And one of the things I'd like you to explore is malaria and this sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a mutation. It occurs in our gene that causes the cell, the red blood cell, to no longer be a circle, but now to be a sickle shape, a half moon shape. And this sickle cell anemia is prevalent. It's a mutation that is more common in the population than you might expect. And the question is why? So for those of you doing the short version, you're going to watch the first video and you'll see it in the list. For those of you doing the longer version and you want more information, you can watch the short video as well, or the long video, or both. The long video is long. I think it's 15 minutes. The short video is 3 or 4 minutes long. Before you watch the video, do refer to the Google Doc, and on the Google Doc you'll see these questions listed. So read the questions beforehand, so when you see the question answered, you have a better chance of answering it. Then answer the questions on your Google Doc. Collaborate, talk to your friends, see if you get the same answers. They're not difficult questions. You watch the video, you can answer them. In some cases, you can answer it without it. Don't Google the answers because you won't get the same learning. Watch the video, look at the example, and here's a positive example of how mutation is selected for and maintained in a population. The next couple of slides, if you go through my PowerPoint, are just slides to help you collect the information of what sickle cell anemia is about. I should have said pause so you can watch the video. Hopefully you figured that out. And so in these slides, it talks about where sickle cell anemia occurs, where malaria is prevalent, how the two overlap, and why and how the two are related. Okay. Now, this slide here, this is something I spend relatively little time on because this is what your culminating task for the unit is going to be focused on. antibiotic resistance. This is one of the major threats. I know we're in this pandemic COVID-19 coronavirus, situation. You're not allowed to leave your home really. And so this seems really serious, and it is. But when you look at the grand scheme of all the things that can affect the human population, antibiotic resistance is huge. And the way antibiotic resistance works is something that you will be exploring in a little bit more detail. A little bit later in this course, we will give you a very specific slide lesson, very short, that kind of summarizes some of the aspects of antibiotic resistance. But this is the example of mutation and natural selection. So what happens, in a nutshell, is a bacteria is making you sick. And as you get sick, you go to the doctor, and the doctor gives you an antibiotic. Bacteria, if I put one down now, in 24 hours, I could easily have 1 million depending on the species of bacteria. When I take that antibiotic over a period of 2 weeks, the antibiotic is designed as a chemical in a number of different ways. It will kill and destroy the bacteria. If I decide, you know what, I feel better after 10 days and I stop taking the antibiotic, there's a good chance that some of the resistant bacteria, the ones that could have died, but they're more resistant, they live. And so even though you might have killed 95% of them, 99% of them, that 1 or 5 or 10% of bacteria, they have increased antibiotic resistance, and they pass on their traits to additional generations. And eventually, over a short period of time, you have antibiotic resistance. And now I know I said that in a lot of words. As I mentioned before, there'll be a further PowerPoint that talks about this in more detail. The first two, natural selection and mutation, they are very selective. They act on a particular genotype or an allele. Non-selective mechanisms that contribute to microevolution, these last three, they will act on anything, regardless of the genotype or allele. So let's take a look at what these mean. Gene flow is exactly like it sounds. Gene flow, genetic drift, and non-random mating. We're going to go over these three concepts. In non-random mating, this is where mating is based on what you look like. So in blister beetles, a population of blister beetles, small blister beetles will only mate with small blister beetles, well, normally, more likely, and large blister beetles will mate with large blister beetles. That's called non-random or assortative mating. In random mating, like you see in coral, they just release eggs and sperm into the ocean currents, and then whatever happens, happens. Okay, so that's your difference. So assortative mating can lead to microevolution. Gene flow is migration. So that's the movement of genes from one location to another. So if you look at this population of trees, they are separated from all the other trees by a large body of water. And so this gene pool will have time to adapt to that particular environment and possibly change. In migration, pollen from a nearby island might come from these trees, and they might fertilize these trees. So you get this migration of genes from one population to the next. If you have migration, you're less likely to have microevolution. Genetic drift. So in genetic drift, let's say I flip a coin once. I might get heads, I might get tails. It could be 50-50, it could be 100% heads, 100% tails. If I flip it 10 times, same thing. If I flip it 1,000 times, like the larger the population size I have, the less likely chance is going to have an impact. What I encourage you to do is go to a site that had opened up. It's called random.org. And in this site here, you can select all sorts of coins and various things to flip. So I'm going to flip a whole bunch of Canadian toonies, 10 of them. And I got 1, 2, 3, 4 tails, and I got 5 and 5, which is kind of expected, right? So I could do it again. I could keep on doing it. And generally speaking, because it's not the largest population, but I'm probably going to get something that's close to 50. Here I got 4 and 6. If I had changed that number from 10 down to 2, it wouldn't be unreasonable to get 100% of one or the other. So the higher my population, the greater my population, the less likely chance is going to have an impact. So what does that mean in terms of our genetics and in terms of our evolution? Well, take a look at this. So here's our definition for genetic drift. It's genetic variation due to chance. Here is a population of wildflowers. And in this population of wildflowers, there are homozygous dominant red, there are heterozygous red, so red's dominant, and there's homozygous recessive white. Back to genetics, hopefully you recognize that. And in my population here, let's say I take my first population. In my first generation, I have 9 plants that are red, that are homozygous dominant and heterozygous, and 1 plant that's white. Okay? Now, in that first population, 5 plants, it so happens that 5 plants are going to leave offspring. So they're the ones that are going to reproduce. The other plants don't. And so when those plants undergo their process, the next generation, look what we have. We end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 red plants, homozygous, dominant, heterozygous, and 1, 2, 3 white plants. That's reasonable. We could expect that. So now let's fast forward again. This generation here, it's still a very small population. And instead of 5 plants leaving offspring, only 2 plants are selected. And notice the 2 plants are selected, they both happen to be homozygous dominant. There are no recessive alleles in these 2 plants, a very small population. Our white plants and our heterozygous have not had the opportunity to reproduce. And now, only because of these 2 plants reproduced, every single plant in the next generation is homozygous dominant. We've now lost the recessive allele. That is an example of genetic drift. And why did it happen? Because of chance, random chance. Not natural selection, not a mutation, just random chance. It just happened. So genetic drift is something that affects populations. It normally affects populations when the population is small, however. 2 major types of genetic drift exist that we will talk about in this course. One is called the founder's effect, where you have an original population, let's say in England, and then a small group of that population might move from England over to, let's say, the United States, and they might produce a community known as the Amish or the Pennsylvania Dutch. And so now the smaller group has very reduced genetic diversity, which we talked about on day 1 of this course. And you might have some of the genes missing. And so when you take a look at some of these founding populations, you will see some really interesting genetic problems. Extra fingers, certain diseases. Jacob Creutzfeldt's disease is another common one that happens. So these things here is due to the founder effect, which is a specific genetic drift. Another example of something going wrong is the bottleneck effect. And this is more us humans going out and killing animals. But it could be forest fires. It's indiscriminate. It doesn't care if you're big or small. It's a fire coming. So when a fire goes through, very few things will survive. Or a flood. Or an earthquake. Something big. And so at the end of this, you end up with very few genes. Humans have done this. We've hunted many animals. We've got them as pets, or we want their pelts, or we want to eat them. And as we kill the otters and reduce their population to nothing, or the cheetahs and reduce their population to nothing, what few are left, they might actually, given enough time, grow back into a proper population. But now the genetic diversity is much reduced. And this effect is known as the bottleneck effect. So that is microevolution. Microevolution has 5 components: natural selection, mutation, which are both selective, and your non-selective includes your gene flow, genetic drift, and let's say we want to determine if evolution could happen in a population. We have a mathematical model, as we did with the chi-square, as we did when we're doing other genetic problems. We have a mathematical model that we can use to determine if a population is undergoing evolution. That model is known as the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, named after the two scientists, the mathematicians actually, who put this relationship together. So we are able to use this model to determine if evolution is occurring. For evolution to occur, certain things must be in existence. Evolution does not occur if we have these 5 conditions met: a very large population, no emigration or immigration, no mutations, random mating, and no natural selection. If all these things are true, then there's no evolution. But in the real world, this does not happen. In the real world, typically at least one of those things is going to happen, if not 2 or 3. Right? So mutations, selection,